This is Gerald Horn for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Hiroshi Fukurai, professor of sociology and legal studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And for our purposes here today, he's teaching a course presently on the Black Panther Party. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Fukurai.
Thank you for inviting me, Professor Hong.
Thank you for joining us. So with regard to this course that you're teaching, of course, many in our audience may remember that the founder of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, actually studied at your campus in Santa Cruz. But generally speaking, why did you choose to construct this course on the Black Panther Party?
Ever since I started teaching in 1990, I was kind of surprised by knowing that not many people knows UCSC's deep historical connections to Black Panther Party, as well as the Black political activism in Santa Cruz, as well as in neighboring regions. So that's one of the motives that I had to design this class. And also last year, we have named one of the colleges to John Lewis. And as everybody knows, he's the chairperson of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we had the numerous faculty members who were actually SNCC members taught on this campus. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for students to know the UCSC's deep historical connections. And so that's the key motivation why I created this class. Actually, the name of the class is kind of unique. I named it Banana Slugs and Black Panthers. So that's the name of the title of the class, because the banana slug is the UCSC's mascot, which is famous inhabitants in Redwood Forest, in which the UCSC campus was built.
Now, I should also add that I'm doing research as we speak on the Black Panther Party, and I've come to find out that during their heyday, there were some who were tied to the party, loosely perhaps, that had sought to construct guerrilla training camps in the hills surrounding Santa Cruz, interestingly enough. But I should also add that you happen to be of Japanese ancestry. And we also know that before 1945, Japan was a nation that was greatly admired by many Black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey had contradictions between and amongst themselves, but all shared a common fondness for Tokyo and for Japan. And in that regard, I understand that during this period, the first half of the 20th century, that a number of Japanese nationals studied at HBCUs, historically Black campuses and universities. Talk to us about that relationship.
Definitely. Prior to Second World War, almost like 50 to 60 years, there are many Japanese intellectuals came to the United States and educated at historically Black colleges and universities. And like Sen Katayama, he became the original member of the American Communist Party, and after he returned to Japan, he became a co-founder of the Japanese Communist Party, was educated at the Melville College in Knoxville, Tennessee, the historically Black college here in the United States. And also a very famous American educator by the name of Alice Bacon, who was a teacher at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, which is a precursor to today's Hampton University. I used to teach in Japan at the Pierre Reese School, which is a special school for girls of high nobility and aristocracy. So many progressive thinkers, men and women went on to study and being educated at Hampton. And one of those people being educated at Hampton was Zenichiro Oyabe. He's a very famous educator and Japanese intellectual. And also he became a very strong political activist who attended not only Hampton, but also he went on to attend the Howard University and received a master's degree. And later he became a pastor. And after his return to Japan, he opened a school on behalf of the Japan's indigenous people called the Ainu people, and became the major political force to speak for Ainu's rights to self-determination and cultural preservation, and perhaps having learned historical discrimination against Africans in the United States, and having adopted similar views of Japanese policies from the perspectives of the marginalized groups and populations. And this Alice Bacon, a teacher at the Hampton, also helped while she was in Japan, a very famous educator by the name of Umeko Tsura, who was also educated in the United States. And she went on to build Japan's first women's college with the support of Alice Bacon. This university is now called the Tsuda University, a renowned higher educational institution for women in Japan. And so W. Du Bois, of course, visited in Japan in 1930s to build close ties between Japanese progressive circles and Japanese nationals, American African nationalists in the United States. So there have been a very close ties of Japanese as well as American intellectuals, especially those Japanese being educated in historically Black colleges and universities in the United States.
We also know that Japanese Americans along the Pacific coast, from Seattle to San Diego, particularly in Los Angeles and in the Southland more generally, were interned in concentration camps between 1942 and 1945 during the Pacific War. Their property was seized. However, decades later, they received a kind of reparations. And now we understand that some of these Japanese Americans are now campaigning for reparations for Black Americans. Could you talk to us about that?
Definitely. The Japanese American Citizens League has endorsed the reparation for descendants of enslaved Africans. And I have been a member of the JSCL Watsonville, Santa Cruz chapter. And we endorsed the reparation so did many chapters of JSCL. And it is important to recognize that JSCL became the also in other avenues to speak for the rights of those who are being discriminated or being potentially targeted by the U.S. Predatory policies against non-white populations. And UC Santa Cruz has the Asian Pacific Islander group, and we have been discussing on the reparation issue. And as we know, we learned many African slaves were brought to California by Texan enslavers after 1848 during the frenzy gold rush era, while simultaneously opening up the indigenous ancestral homelands through the executive orders issued by the California politicians, including Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of the state of California, whose government actually paid $1.5 million to exterminate California Indians. So in my opinion, we also need to support the reparations to Africans in other states and the regions, including possibly the Caribbean, Latin America, especially in Africa. And largely thanks to your work, Professor Holm, U.S. enslavers, especially after Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1836 and became deeply involved in the slave trade, especially in Cuba and in Brazil. Even after the Civil War, U.S. enslavers continued to engage in slave trade, kidnapping and trading Melanesians and the Polynesians in the Pacific, building the business base in Fiji's and other islands to profit from the slavery. So I believe the reparation for Africans should open up more serious discussions on the reparation movements of European powers who profited enormously from the exploitation of both African and indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, in causing the immiserations of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the globe. So this reparation movement, which started in California, could become the opening of equally important debates on European historical plunder of the world, as well as their reparation necessity to pay to those victims of their colonialism extended around the globe.
We also know that in August 1945, perhaps the most profound episode of mass murder in world history took place when U.S. bomber planes dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Do you have any insight to share with regard to the racist motivations of this crime against humanity?
We no longer can interview the principal architect of Japanese bombing, including the Air Force General Curtis LeMay, for any of his racist intentions. But based on his memoirs and writings, Mr. LeMay was famous for making rather racist statements, including, quote, "killing Japanese didn't bother me very much," unquote, among many, many others. From his grand design of aerial fire bombings of many Japanese towns and cities, including the March 10th bombing of Tokyo that killed 100,000, mostly women, children, and elderly, it was rather obvious that he intended to exterminate every Japanese person, as his predecessors in the Philippines tried to accomplish some 40 years earlier. So in looking at the history of anti-Asian sentiments, including today's strong anti-Chinese ethos, it has deep historical roots in Europeans' ideological formation. Professor Roxanne Danvers-Ortiz, who famously wrote the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, looks into this in her more recent publication, where she examines the writing of Marco Polo and other European travelers to China and East Asia, who reported of the highly advanced Chinese civilization in the 1200s, being exposed to the invention of porcelain, high-quality tea, spice, silk, which is the cloth made out of insect, gunpowder, among many others that the Europeans did not have, predicting China's future potential threats to Christianity and the European civilization. In 1289, Pope sent 100 Christian scholars to China, but the Ming Dynasty expelled the European scholars by the mid-14th century, and there were no Christians in China by 1500s. So this anti-Chinese or anti-Asian sentiments has been brewed in Europe for many hundreds of years. And today, many scientists believe that China has already leapfrogged the US in terms of the key strategic technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, green technology, and even quantum computing, threatening the technological and scientific domination of the North Atlantic powers, including the United States, further amplifying this Chinese, anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiments. So this, anti-Chinese sentiments have much deep historical roots.
Speaking of deep historical roots and returning to your course on the Black Panther Party at the University of California, Santa Cruz, why do you begin your course with an examination of the Moorish invasion and conquest of a good deal of Southern Europe from about the 8th century to the end of the 15th century?
Well, actually, that part of history is the major part of my class. But at the same time, before that, we focus on the great civilizations developed in Egypt. And much of the Egyptian knowledge, science, medicine, and philosophy had been transferred into the Greek civilization. So I start with the conquest of Nubia about the 3000 BC. And as you know, that one of the great warriors in Japan by the name of, it's kind of a long name, Sakanoue no Tamunawaro. He's a hero in 750 AD. He was a Nubian. He was one of those African diaspora people. And he reached to Japan. He served imperial house, and he became a hero in subduing the Japanese indigenous populations. So going back to Nubia, Nubia was colonized by Egypt about the 3000 BC. That's about 5,000 years ago. And then first dynasty through 23rd dynasty, that is the 880 BC. That's about 2,900 years ago. Egypt has entered the 23rd dynasty. But the tremendous advancement in mathematics and science, philosophy had been stored in the library of Alexandria. That's where the Aristotles and many great Greek philosophers and scholars actually studied and formed the foundation. And that knowledge had been taken over also by the Muslim, which led to the glorious Islamic golden age, starting from 8th until 13th century, during which, starting from 711 to 1492, the Moors, Moors means in Greek dark, or if not black, they, after they sacked the remaining Roman stronghold in Tunis, in Tunisia, in 699, marched all the way into the entirety into the Iberian Peninsula and colonized the southern region of France and the southern region of the Europe, including Eastern Europe. And that occupation became the basis through the transmission of great Islamic knowledge, which absorbed the Greek civilization, and through the practice of something called the La Convivencia in Espanol, and that means the cohabitation among three religious groups: Jews, Arabs, and Christians. And through this practice of La Convivencia, much of the Islamic text that absorbed those wonderful knowledge of Egypt transferred by Greek philosophers and scientists, translated into Latin and Hebrew. And that's one of the reasons that many of the great scientists of Europe actually study Latin. Even Newton, supposed to be the inventor of calculus. The calculus was already devised by the Mohammed al-Kharaj in 900 BC. And those knowledge being transmitted. So the occupation of the Moors, the Africans, of these very important regions, which gave foundation to the science and technology, starting from 13th, 14th century, they all came from Africa. And that's the reason we have to go back to the Nubia and Egyptian civilizations, a tremendous advancement in mathematics especially, even going back to the computation of pi, the ratio of the circumference of the circle to diameter. And those are the knowledge used to create the exactly same shaped pyramids. There are more than 100 pyramids built in Egypt. And so those started from 2500 BC, about 4,500 years ago. So those kinds of knowledge base coming from Africa needs to be shared. were the people. That's the reason I started from Egypt through Greek and through Moors and the occupation of Iberian Peninsula and southern region of Europe.
Now, back to the Black Panther Party, you also discuss in your course the impact of the so-called COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program of the U.S. authorities. What do you share with your students about COINTELPRO?
Well, COINTELPRO is a program devised by specifically the direction of J. Edgar Hoover from 1950s, and before it was being exposed 1971 by the activists who raided the FBI field office, and they stole a bunch of documents, and we now know who actually stole it, and many of those actually spoke in various venues, including Democracy Now!, which had a very detailed account of how those people actually stole the information. And they found out there was a program called COINTELPRO, and it stands for Counterintelligence Program. And they targeted CPU USA, Socialist Workers Party, and entire left, including Southern Christian Conference, Martin Luther King, and surveillance of Malcolm X, of course, Black Panther Party, and young laws organizations, and many of the women's liberation groups. And so surveillance has been there. Even before the COINTELPRO, there have been very similar programs. And it's been used to surveil UNIA, for instance, Universal Negro Improvement Association, and Marcus Garvey was being targeted. And it's quite interesting because UNIA had actually worked with the Japanese, I would say, intelligence officers, so to speak, to create destabilization during the 1930s, and also worked with the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, and many others. And again, they're being surveilled by the FBI. But COINTELPRO is a specific program under J. Edgar Hoover, devised from 1956 to 1971, I believe. But many people believe that the FBI surveillance program, under different nomenclature, still continues.
Finally, Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, Professor of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, would you recommend to Black students and their audience that they should consider attending your lovely campus?
As an educator and as a teacher of the class that I teach, not only this Black Panther class, but also teach Race and Law, which looks into, as I mentioned, about the Moorish conquest of Iberian Peninsula, and also the many other race-related issues. And there are many other wonderful faculty at UC Santa Cruz who would welcome the African students to this campus. And we can educate ourselves based on our common knowledge and their experiences. And I'm originally from Japan, and I was born and raised, and I went through college. I came here, and I began to also realize the similarly situated groups in Japan, including minority populations, as the Koreans, and also historically discriminated groups called the Eta and Hinin, or today we call Burakmin, and also Okinawans and the Ainu people. And so we can actually share the experiences and try to find a path toward more just and a fair society together. So I would welcome African students, and I'm sure the many faculty at UC Santa Cruz would also welcome African students to this campus.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, Professor of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for inviting me.